The rain transformed Chicago into an urban aquarium that November night, when Sarah Mitchell, 28 years old, fell to her knees before the most powerful man in America. She clutched two soaked newborns against her chest, while water pooled on the immaculate marble of the Blackstone Tower. David Blackstone, Billionaire CEO, froze, recognizing the woman he'd loved and abandoned 9 months earlier. The twins in her arms had his same steel-gray eyes. Sarah lifted one of the babies toward him with a desperate gesture. The words that emerged broke every heart present. "Take Michael. I can't raise them both. At least he'll have a life." Security moved to intervene, but David raised his hand, paralyzed by the revelation. They were his sons, his blood that he didn't know existed. He gently took the offered baby, then did something that shocked the entire lobby. He removed his $10,000 coat and wrapped the other twin. "I don't separate brothers, and I don't abandon their mother. Never again." But as he spoke those words, the secret he harbored weighed like lead. Pancreatic cancer gave him 6 months to live, and he had just decided how to spend them. Chicago drowned under a biblical deluge that evening of November 15th. The storm drains overflowed, transforming Michigan Avenue into a black river that carried debris and broken dreams toward the outskirts. Sarah Mitchell had walked 3 miles from the South Side, from the forgotten neighborhood where she survived in a studio apartment with mold and roaches. The 3-month-old twins were pressed against her chest, protected only by a wool blanket she'd found at the Salvation Army, and her torn jacket held together with safety pins. The Blackstone Tower rose in the financial district like a monolith of glass and steel, 40 floors of absolute power piercing the leaden sky. Sarah stopped before the monumental entrance, her reflection in the crystal doors showing what she'd become. A 28-year-old woman aged by 10 years, hair once lustrous, now dull and plastered to her skull, green eyes that had enchanted a billionaire now ringed with desperation. Through the doors she could see the other world, the one she'd brushed against for one night, 9 months earlier. Carrara marble that cost more than she'd earn in a lifetime. Waterford crystal chandeliers spreading golden light on men in $20,000 suits. And him, David Blackstone, emerging surrounded by his entourage like a Roman emperor among praetorians. David was 40 years old, carried with the confidence that comes from absolute power. The Tom Ford suit seemed sculpted on his still athletic body, despite 14-hour workdays. But it was his eyes that betrayed him. Those steel-gray eyes Sarah remembered burning with passion, now dimmed by an exhaustion that went beyond physical. She didn't know about the verdict he'd carried in his blood for 3 months. Pancreatic adenocarcinoma. Stage 4. Inoperable. Recognition when Sarah crossed the threshold, dripping, was instant and brutal. The waitress from the Valentine's Day charity gala, the one with whom he'd betrayed all his rules by taking her to the Four Seasons. A night of unbridled sex and surprisingly deep conversations. Then her escape at dawn and weeks of fruitless searches. But now here she was, a soaked ghost of his past with 2 bundles moving weakly in her arms. Security moved to block her, but David had already seen everything. The way she protected the babies, the animal desperation in her eyes, and especially the infants' faces when one opened his eyes for an instant. Steel gray, his eyes in miniature. Sarah fell to her knees on the cold marble, a gesture that made everyone present hold their breath. Water formed a pool around her as she raised one of the twins toward David. The scene was surreal. The beggar and the king, extreme poverty and obscene wealth, united by 2 innocent babies. The words that emerged from Sarah's mouth were broken by sobs she tried to stifle. She told her story in fragments. The pregnancy discovered too late. Immediate firing from the restaurant where she worked. Months spent looking for work with a growing belly. Delivery in a public hospital with nurses who looked at her with contempt. Nights spent awake while the twins cried from hunger. and she had no milk because she wasn't eating enough. David listened petrified while his ordered world collapsed. The calculations were simple. 9 months from the Valentine's Gala, the night when too much champagne and too much loneliness had led him to break his iron rule about not mixing sex and work. Sarah had been different, though. Not the usual social climber. She'd talked about books, dreams, a future she wanted to build, studying at night to graduate. He took Michael from Sarah's arms with movements that seemed automatic, as if his hands already knew what to do. The baby weighed almost nothing, a bundle of bones and skin that stirred weakly at the temperature change. Then he looked at James, still pressed to Sarah's chest, identical to his brother but quieter, as if he'd already learned that crying was useless. The decision he made in that moment wasn't rational. It was visceral, instinctive, dictated by something deeper than thought. Perhaps it was the memory of his brother Matthew, dead at 8, leaving him alone in a family that no longer knew how to love. Perhaps it was awareness of the death he carried inside, the need to leave something more than a financial empire. Or perhaps it was simply the way Sarah looked at the baby that remained with her, as if she were about to tear her heart from her chest. He removed his cashmere coat, ignoring the cold entering through the automatic doors, and wrapped James with meticulous care. The gesture spoke more than any declaration. Then he helped Sarah to her feet, noticing how light she was, how the months of deprivation had consumed her. David's entourage watched the scene in shocked silence. Charles Bennett, his assistant for 15 years, already had his phone in hand calculating media damage. Attorney Morrison was mentally preparing non-disclosure agreements, but David ignored them all, focused only on the trembling woman, and the 2 babies he'd just discovered were his. The presidential suite at the Chicago Four Seasons occupied an entire floor of the hotel, 5,000 square feet of luxury that seemed like another planet compared to the squalid studio Sarah came from. They took her there in a Bentley while Chicago slipped past the tinted windows like a black and white film. The twins, finally warm, had stopped crying and slept exhausted. Dr. Reynolds arrived within 30 minutes, pulled from a gala at the Art Institute. He was David's personal physician, the one who knew the secret of the cancer and had learned not to ask uncomfortable questions. He examined Sarah, finding her malnourished but fundamentally healthy, the babies miraculously in good condition despite months of hardship. While Sarah immersed herself in the first hot bath in months, David remained alone with the twins sleeping in emergency cribs the hotel had procured. He studied them with the intensity with which he analyzed corporate balance sheets, looking for himself in those tiny faces. He found it in the tufts of black hair identical to his, in the shape of the hands, in the way Michael furrowed his brow in sleep exactly as he did when concentrated. Attorney Morrison arrived with a briefcase of documents and uncomfortable questions. He wanted DNA tests, non-disclosure agreements, strategies to minimize damage to public image. David silenced him with a gesture. There was no need for tests. He knew in his bones they were his. And as for image damage, what did it matter? In 6 months, he'd be dead anyway. Sarah emerged from the bathroom transformed. Clean, with dry hair and a hotel bathrobe on, the remnants of the beauty that had struck him 9 months earlier were visible. But more than physical beauty, there was something fierce in her now, the determination of a mother who had fought against the impossible. They sat in the suite's living room while the babies slept. Sarah told everything without filters. How she'd tried to contact him but was rejected by his secretary. How she'd considered abortion, but it was too late when she discovered the pregnancy. How she'd lived on expedience and charity in recent months. She spoke of the pain of giving birth alone, of nurses who treated her like trash, of nights spent rocking 2 screaming babies while her body gave out from hunger. David listened, feeling every word like a nail in the coffin of his conscience. He'd lived 9 months in his golden world while she faced hell. He'd spent millions on futile investments while his sons grew in poverty. The irony was atrocious. He who was dying without heirs had had 2 sons under his nose all along. The arrangement he proposed was generous to the point of absurdity. An apartment on Lakeshore Drive, unlimited bank account, nannies, driver, everything Sarah could desire. But he put one condition. He wanted to be part of the babies' lives. Not a Sunday father, but a constant presence. Sarah accepted with a readiness that surprised him. There was no wounded pride or attempts at negotiation, just relief, as if an unbearable weight had finally been lifted from her shoulders. She didn't know that David was calculating every day he had left, dividing 6 months by all the things he wanted to teach his sons. 2 weeks in the Lakeshore Drive penthouse had transformed Sarah into a creature suspended between 2 worlds. Every morning she touched the silk sheets to make sure she wasn't dreaming while the twins slept in cribs that cost more than she'd earned in a year. But there was a shadow in that paradise. David carried death in his eyes. Sarah saw it in details he thought he hid. Pills swallowed in secret, grimaces of pain masked as yawns, whispered phone calls with doctors from the bathroom. Above all, there was that desperate hunger in the way he looked at the babies, as if he wanted to devour every second before it was too late. The truth exploded on a rainy evening. David arrived staggering, the pain so intense he had to grip the door. When Sarah forced him to sit and confronted him with the determination forged by the street, he collapsed. Pancreatic cancer, terminal stage, 3 months of life remaining. Sarah's reaction was visceral. First the slap that echoed in the silent apartment, then the desperate embrace, while she cursed cruel fate. They kissed with the desperation of those who know every kiss could be the last, separating only when the twins cried, as if they'd sensed the drama. The transfer to Mayo Clinic happened in a frenzied week. Rochester, Minnesota, became their battlefield against death. David entered doctor.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
Steinberg's experimental trial with nightmare statistics. 5% chance of response, 1% of remission. The protocol was torture disguised as cure, immunotherapy that poisoned him, radiation that burned him, fever that consumed him. Sarah orchestrated everything with military precision. Morning visits with the twins when David still had strength. Afternoons in the hospital. Nights watching him while he raved. The 3rd week was hell. David vomited black bile, screamed in his sleep, touched death with his fingers. But Sarah refused to surrender, bringing the twins into the hospital bed against all protocol. The miracle was subtle, but real. At contact with his sons, vital signs stabilized. The body found strength to fight. After a month, the impossible. The tumor had stopped growing. Not victory, but truce. Meanwhile, from the hospital, David had to fight another war. Vice President Harrison attempted a corporate coup, but David, skeletal but fierce, orchestrated a ruthless counteroffensive. A video with the twins in his arms and veiled threats about dossiers he possessed was enough to crush the rebellion. March arrived with a sudden thaw that transformed Rochester into a swamp of melted snow and cautious hope. The latest scans showed the unthinkable. The tumor was shrinking. Millimeters, but shrinking. David's immune system had learned to fight, aided by experimental therapies, and, according to Sarah, by the love surrounding him. The return to Chicago in April was a silent triumph. David had lost 30 pounds and was weak as a newborn, but he was alive. The lakefront mansion he'd proposed as refuge became their home. It was an early 20th century palace with faded glory and family ghosts, but Sarah transformed it into something alive with toys scattered in the parlors and diapers drying on the garden statues. The routine they established was simple and precious. Slow mornings with the babies in the master bed, David reading the Wall Street Journal aloud while the twins crawled on the comforter. Afternoons in the garden when sun permitted, Sarah preparing elaborate lunches David could barely touch, but pretended to appreciate. Evenings before the fireplace, the babies asleep between them while they watched the lake turn black under the moon. It was on one of these evenings, while May painted the garden with flowers, that David proposed. He didn't kneel, his knees were still too weak, but took Sarah's hand across the space separating them on the couch. He asked her to marry him with the same simplicity with which he'd ask her to pass the salt. Sarah laughed and cried together, a sound that woke the twins and made them protest. She said yes, while James pulled her hair, and Michael drooled on David's shirt. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense, but it was perfect in its chaotic domesticity. They married in the mansion's chapel on June 15th, with only the twins, Charles Bennett, and the nanny as witnesses. Sarah wore a simple dress bought at a downtown boutique. David, the first suit that didn't hang loose on him in months. The babies, in blue onesies already stained with milk, provided the soundtrack with their gurgles and occasional shrieks. The party was in the garden with mansion staff and few intimates. Nothing grand, but David managed to dance a slow dance with Sarah, though they had to stop after 30 seconds because his legs wouldn't hold him. They sat instead on a bench, watching the lake, while guests danced, the twins sleeping in the stroller beside them. The months that followed were a roller coaster. The tumor seemed to play hide-and-seek, shrinking, then regrowing, keeping everyone on edge. David gradually resumed control of the company, working from home, appearing on video, always seated to hide weakness. But above all, he lived every moment with fierce intensity. He saw Michael's first steps in the parlor, where he himself had learned to walk. He heard James's first word, "Dada," whispered on an October morning. He took them on the family boat, though Sarah protested he was too weak. He taught them to recognize constellations on summer nights, all four lying on the grass while mosquitoes devoured them. The twins' first birthday was an event that entered Lake Michigan legend. David, against all medical advice, organized a party with 200 guests, fireworks, hot air balloons. It was excessive and perfect, like everything he did now that every day was an unexpected bonus. 5 years after that rainy night in Chicago, David Blackstone sat in the mansion garden, watching his sons play. Michael and James, now two 5-and-a-half-year-old tornadoes of energy, were building an elaborate sandcastle while arguing over every detail. Sarah, 6 months pregnant with their third child, read under the shade of the oak tree where David had played with his brother Matthew 40 years earlier. The miracle wasn't that he was alive, though doctors continued to study his case as a statistical anomaly. The miracle was the normalcy of that scene. An ordinary family on an ordinary afternoon, precious precisely in its ordinariness. The cancer hadn't disappeared. It remained there, an unwelcome tenant held at bay by increasingly sophisticated therapy cycles. Every 6 months the scans, every 6 months the held breath, every 6 months the celebration of another period of grace. But David had learned to live with uncertainty, to treat it as the price to pay for each sunrise more. Blackstone Industries had changed under his new perspective. He'd created revolutionary corporate welfare programs, daycare centers at every location, extended paternity leave. Profits had paradoxically increased with happier, more productive employees. The board, the same one that had tried to dethrone him, now hailed him as a visionary. But it was the small moments that really counted. Chaotic breakfasts with the twins spilling milk on his documents. Afternoons spent teaching them to swim in the lake, though he could barely stay afloat from weakness. Evenings when Sarah fell asleep with her head on his shoulder, while they watched terrible movies the kids loved. That particular evening, as the sun set, dyeing the lake liquid copper, Sarah sat beside him on the bench, her pregnant belly pressed against his side, as they watched the children now destroying the castle for the pure pleasure of destruction. David thought back to that night in the rain, when Sarah had offered him one of the twins. The image of her kneeling on the cold marble, ready to tear half her heart to save the other half, remained burned in his memory. It had been the moment he'd understood what courage really was, not conquering companies or accumulating billions, but sacrificing everything for love. He'd made his choice that night, refusing to separate the brothers, but it had been Sarah who'd really saved him, dragging him to Mayo, forcing him to fight when he would have preferred to surrender. She'd transformed his last months into years, his death sentence into an infinitely renegotiable truce. The baby in Sarah's belly kicked, and David put his hand on the bump, feeling life pulsing beneath the skin. Another child he might see grow, might not, but who would know that his father had fought for every day, had wrested every hour from fate? Michael ran toward them covered in sand from head to toe, followed by James protesting some fraternal injustice. They climbed on their parents without ceremony, dirtying everything with sand and lake water. David hugged them, feeling the weight of their solid bodies, the smell of sweaty and happy child, the warmth of their exuberant life. "Dad, tomorrow we build a boat?" Michael asked, with that absolute seriousness of children. "A real boat that floats," James added. David looked at Sarah, who smiled, hand on belly, surrounded by the chaos of their improbable family. He thought of the cancer lurking, the statistics that said he shouldn't be there, the daily miracle of waking up still alive. "Sure," he told his sons, "tomorrow we build a boat." Because tomorrow would be there. He was as certain as he was certain of nothing. Tomorrow he would wake up, kiss Sarah, argue with the twins over cereal, work 2 hours, build a boat destined to sink. Tomorrow he would live. The story of David Blackstone and the waitress who'd offered him one of her twins had become legend in the American business world. But the real story was simpler and more extraordinary. A man who'd chosen not to separate a family when he could have, a woman who'd chosen to fight when she could have surrendered, and 2 children who'd become the reason to defy death itself. That night, while Chicago slept and the lake whispered ancient secrets, the Blackstone family slept all in the king bed. The twins had had a nightmare and slipped between their parents. Sarah snored softly with her hand on her belly. David kept watching them in the dark. He was alive, against all odds, against all statistics. He was gloriously, incredibly alive. And as dawn began to tinge the sky beyond the skyline, David Blackstone understood the simplest truth. Sometimes, life takes everything away. Health, certainties, the future, to give you the only thing that really matters. Today, this moment, this imperfect and beautiful family that fate had assembled from a night of rain and desperation. The miracle wasn't the cancer's remission. The miracle was that a desperate mother had knocked on the right door, that a dying billionaire had chosen love over logic, that 2 twins had united 2 broken souls into something whole. The miracle was every extra morning, conquered not with medicine or billions, but with the stubborn, irrational, magnificent decision to live. Like if you believe love can win even against impossible odds, comment with the moment that touched your heart. Share to give hope to those fighting impossible battles. Subscribe for more stories of courage and rebirth, because sometimes life takes everything away to give you what really matters. And sometimes offering half your heart means receiving a whole one in return. But always, always, a family's love can work miracles that medicine can't explain.